Picture 3 ounces. That's it. 3 ounces of physical material. That's roughly the weight of a few slices of bread or a small handful of coins sitting in your palm. Now imagine that 3 ounces is all that's left of a human being. A mother of 3, a flight attendant who crossed the Atlantic for a living, a woman who was, by every account, simply trying to survive a marriage that had turned cold and cruel. 3 ounces. And somehow, out of that almost nothing, investigators built a case strong enough to send a man to prison for murder, without ever finding a body. This case is one of the strangest, most meticulously unraveled true crime stories you'll ever hear. It's the case that became the very first episode of Forensic Files, and it's the case where a husband thought he had committed the perfect crime, until forensic science, one fragment at a time, proved him catastrophically wrong. This is the story of Helle Crafts. Before we get into the horror of what happened to her, let's actually meet her, because Helle deserves better than being a footnote in her own story. Helle Lork Nielsen was born on July 7, 1947, in Charlottenlund, Denmark. She grew up to become a flight attendant, first with Pan Am, the airline that at the time practically defined glamour in international travel. Think about what that job meant in that era. It wasn't just a career, it was a life spent crossing oceans, meeting people from every corner of the globe, and building a kind of independence that a lot of women of her generation weren't handed easily. Helle earned that independence herself. In 1975, she married Richard Crafts. On paper, he seemed like a solid match, an Eastern Airlines pilot, a former Marine with the kind of Green Beret-type background that suggests discipline, toughness, someone who could provide and protect. But underneath that resume was a volatile temper, the kind that doesn't always show itself until you're deep enough into a relationship that leaving feels complicated. The two of them settled down in the quiet, picturesque town of Newtown, Connecticut. They had 3 children together. And through all of it, Helle kept flying, kept working, kept building her own identity even as she raised a family. She wasn't a woman who disappeared into domestic life. She kept a foot in the wider world. By 1986, though, that marriage, the one that looked stable from the outside, was falling apart at the seams. Helle wasn't oblivious. She wasn't caught off guard by what was happening to her marriage. She suspected Richard was having multiple affairs, and she started noticing things, specifically suspicious long-distance phone calls that didn't add up. When she confronted him about it, it didn't lead to honesty, it led to anger. So Helle did what a smart, resourceful woman does when she senses she's being deceived. She started building her own case. She consulted a divorce attorney, and she went a step further. She hired a private investigator named Keith Mayo to find out exactly what her husband was doing behind her back. Mayo didn't come back empty-handed. He obtained photographs of Richard kissing another flight attendant outside that woman's home in New Jersey. Proof. Undeniable, in your hands proof that the marriage Helle had built her life around was a lie. And this is the detail that should send a chill down your spine, because Helle said something to her friends around this time that, in hindsight, reads like a woman who somehow sensed exactly what was coming. She told them, "If something happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." She was planning to leave him. She was building a case, gathering evidence, preparing for a future without Richard Crafts. And somewhere inside her, she already knew that walking away might not be simple. Meanwhile, Richard wasn't just a pilot. He pulling around $120,000 a year at the time, which was serious money in the mid-1980s. He was also working part-time as a police officer in the neighboring town of Southbury and volunteering in law enforcement capacity in Newtown too. He had connections. He had a badge. And that kind of local standing has a way of making a man feel untouchable. Like the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to him. November 18th, 1986. Helle had just flown back from a long haul out of Frankfurt, West Germany. Friends dropped her off at the family home in Newtown late that night. She was never seen alive again. That same night, a snowstorm rolled through Connecticut. The kind of storm that blankets roads, muffles sound, and gives anyone with something to hide the perfect cover of darkness and bad visibility. The next morning, Richard told people he was driving Helle and the kids to his sister's house in Westport. Except when he actually arrived at his sister's, Helle wasn't with him. And then the story started. Not one story, several shifting, inconsistent stories, depending on who Richard was talking to. To some people, he said Helle had gone to visit her mother in Denmark. To others, he said she was vacationing in the Canary Islands. To others still, he simply said he didn't know where she was. Now, if your spouse vanished overnight in the middle of a snowstorm and your explanation kept changing depending on who was asking, that would definitely raise harder questions. For Keith Mayo, the private investigator Helle had hired, it didn't take long at all. On December 1st, 1986, Keith Mayo formally reported Helle missing. But the frustrating part that would have made you really furious if you saw it unfolding in real time. Local police were initially dismissive. Why? Because Richard had law enforcement connections. He was one of their own, in a sense, a part-time officer with local credibility, and that seems to have bought him a grace period that an ordinary suspect never would have gotten. But Mayo didn't let it go. He kept pushing, kept escalating, until the case reached the county prosecutor and eventually the Connecticut State Police, people with no personal stake in giving Richard Crafts the benefit of the doubt. And then on December 26th, while Richard was conveniently vacationing with his 3 kids in Florida, police searched the Crafts family home. What they found inside that house should tell you everything about how much a crime scene can still speak, even after someone has tried to erase it. The carpet had been removed from the master bedroom. The family's nanny recalled a large dark stain on that carpet. She described it as roughly grapefruit-sized, and on the mattress itself, investigators found a blood smear. Forensic work on the scene was led by Dr. Henry Lee, one of the most prominent forensic scientists in the country. If he's involved in your case, you know the science is about to get serious. This is where the case shifts from something feels wrong to we can actually prove what happened. Investigators pulled Richard's credit card records and found a string of purchases in the days surrounding Helle's disappearance that together painted an unmistakable picture. A brand new freezer, one that notably was never found anywhere in the house. New bed sheets, a new comforter, a rented wood chipper, and a receipt for a chainsaw. A freezer big enough to matter, that vanished. New bedding, as if the old bedding needed replacing. A wood chipper, a chainsaw. Individually, maybe you could explain any one of those purchases away. Together, in that order, in that time frame, there's really only one story those receipts are telling. And then came the witness who broke the case wide open. A local snowplow driver named Joseph Hine. On the night of November 18th, the very night Helle disappeared, in the middle of that same snowstorm, Hine had seen a U-Haul truck with a wood chipper attached, parked near Lake Zor. Hine didn't just remember it, he led police straight to the spot. This is the moment the entire case hinges on. This is the 3 ounces we opened with. At the shore of Lake Zor, forensic teams recovered approximately 85 grams, about 3 ounces, of human tissue and material. Let's go through exactly what that included, because every single piece of it did work in the eventual courtroom. A crown of a tooth, which forensic dentists were able to match directly to Helle's dental records, bone chips, a fingernail still coated in pink polish, a small, painfully human detail that turns statistics back into a real person, and 2,660 individual strands of bleached blonde hair, along with traces of type O blood, which matched Helle's blood type. Divers went into that freezing lake and recovered something else, a chainsaw sitting underwater. Whoever had used it had ground off the serial number, trying to erase any trace of ownership. But forensic labs have a way of resurrecting numbers that criminals think they've destroyed, and technicians restored that serial number well enough to trace the chainsaw directly back to a purchase made by Richard Crafts. And on that chainsaw, traces of blonde hair. Every single piece of erased evidence had a way of coming back. Based on everything gathered, prosecutors built their theory of what happened that night, and it is genuinely one of the coldest, most calculated disposal methods in American true crime history. They allege that Richard bludgeoned Helle with blunt force trauma in their own bedroom. Then, rather than dealing with the body immediately, he froze it solid in that new freezer, the one that would later disappear entirely. Once frozen, a body is far easier to cut through cleanly, and prosecutors believe that's exactly why he waited. He dismembered the body with the chainsaw once it had hardened, and then during the cover of that snowstorm, fed the remains through the rented wood chipper, scattering the material either into the truck or directly along the lakeshore, letting the storm and the wilderness do the rest of the work of hiding the evidence. To test whether this theory even held up scientifically, the medical examiner, Dr. H. Wayne Carver, ran an experiment using a pig carcass put through the same process. The resulting bone fragments closely matched what had been recovered from the lakeshore, lending hard scientific weight to a theory that might otherwise have sounded almost too extreme to be real. With the forensic evidence assembled, a death certificate for Helle Crafts was issued on January 13, 1987, even though her body, in any conventional sense, no longer existed. Richard Crafts was arrested, but this case didn't wrap up neatly. The first trial in 1988 ended in a mistrial after the jury deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous verdict. For a moment, it must have felt like the case might slip away entirely. Like 3 ounces of tissue and a chainsaw with a restored serial number might not be enough after all. It was enough. In the second trial in 1989, Richard Crafts was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Richard showed little remorse at his own sentencing, and decades later, in 2020, he was released early, citing good behavior and statutory good time credit. At around 82 years old, transitioning through a halfway house and shelter system back into the world he'd spent 30+ years away from. If this story pulled you in, make sure you have liked and subscribed, because we've got more cases just like this one, where science, patience, and one overlooked detail were enough to bring down a killer who thought he'd covered every track.